In the narrow streets of early 18th century Boston, where the scent of ink and salt mixed in the morning air, a boy named Benjamin Franklin chased dreams bigger than the city's docks could hold. Born in 1706, the 15th child of a candlemaker, young Benjamin's world was filled with noise, ringing church bells, ship horns, and the hammering rhythm of workers carving out a new world. But amidst all that clamor, his mind burned brighter than the flame of his father's candles. From the start, Benjamin was different. While others played in the mud or shouted along the harbor, he would stand quietly, watching the sky, wondering why the winds moved as they did, or how the tides obeyed the moon. He was restless, not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. His formal schooling ended when he was barely 10, but he carried with him something far more powerful than a diploma, an insatiable hunger for learning. He devoured every book he could find, from philosophy to mathematics, from the wonders of nature to the art of writing. By candlelight, he would read long into the night, his fingers blackened by ink, his eyes lit with ambition. At 12, his father placed him under the care of his brother James Franklin, who owned a small printing shop. There, Benjamin found his world of words and machines. The smell of ink, the sound of the press, it was music to his mind. But the press also became a battlefield. His brother's temper and pride clashed with Benjamin's growing confidence. Young Franklin wanted to write, to express ideas, but James refused him that chance. So, Franklin did what true visionaries do. He found a way. He began writing essays under a secret name, Mrs. Silence Dogood. Through her voice, he criticized injustice, mocked hypocrisy, and celebrated freedom of thought. His writings spread through Boston, and people admired this mysterious writer who dared to speak truth to power. When James discovered the secret, his rage was explosive, and Benjamin's path to independence was set. At 17, tired of being silenced, Benjamin did the unthinkable. He fled Boston. Alone, with just a few coins in his pocket and a head full of dreams, he walked hundreds of miles until he reached Philadelphia, hungry, exhausted, and unknown. But even as he walked through the dusty streets with bread under his arm, people saw something unusual, a spark, a purpose. Philadelphia would soon discover that this young runaway printer was not just another worker. He was a visionary in the making. Because in Benjamin Franklin's heart burned a belief that would define his entire life. Energy and persistence conquer all things. He wasn't born into power or privilege. He built himself, word by word, page by page, from the ashes of ordinary beginnings. And this was just the beginning of his legend. When Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia, he was barely 17, tired, hungry, and nearly penniless. But his eyes carried a light that even the dust of the road could not dim. This young printer's apprentice would soon rise from a stranger to one of the most respected men in the colonies, all by the strength of his mind and the discipline of his hands. The first years in Philadelphia were a test of endurance. Franklin worked tirelessly in printing houses, earning every coin with sweat and precision. He was quiet, humble, and always learning, studying the art of type, layout, and the rhythm of words that could move men's hearts. But behind that humble exterior, a storm of ambition brewed. He soon caught the attention of the governor, Sir William Keith, who promised to support Franklin in opening his own printing business. Encouraged, Franklin sailed to London to purchase equipment, but when he arrived, he learned Keith's promises were lies. The governor had never sent the money or letters of credit. Franklin, stranded in a foreign city, was left with nothing. But he didn't despair. Instead, he found work as a printer in London, mastering his trade and sharpening his mind further. While others complained, Franklin studied science, philosophy, logic, and politics. He began shaping himself into not just a craftsman, but a thinker. When he returned to Philadelphia years later, he brought back more than skill. He brought vision. He opened his own print shop and began publishing newspapers, essays, and books that would change colonial thought. His paper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, became one of the most influential voices in America. Through it, Franklin wrote on virtue, freedom, self-discipline, and the power of knowledge. But he wasn't just spreading words, he was spreading awakening. Then came his most beloved creation, Poor Richard's Almanac. Under the pen name Richard Saunders, Franklin delivered wit, wisdom, and moral lessons to the common people. Every issue contained lines that echoed through generations. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Well done is better than well said. Diligence is the mother of good luck. These weren't just sayings, they were blueprints for life. Franklin believed the strength of a nation rested not on kings, but on the character of its people. Beyond his writings, Franklin's curiosity reached every corner of human experience. He founded the Junto Club, a society of thinkers and doers who met to discuss ideas for improving the city. From this club would rise Philadelphia's first public library, fire department, and even early ideas of community insurance, all born from Franklin's relentless drive to make society smarter and safer. He lived simply, but thought grandly. He saw knowledge as light, and he would soon chase that light into the very heart of a storm. By the mid-1740s, Benjamin Franklin had already become one of the most admired men in Philadelphia, a successful printer, a philosopher, a civic builder. But what truly separated him from others was not his wealth or influence, it was his restless curiosity. Franklin believed that knowledge was not something to be stored in books, it was something to be tested. To him, the world was a grand workshop, and every storm, spark, and shadow was a clue waiting to be understood. At night, when most of Philadelphia slept, Franklin could often be seen wandering the streets, watching the sky, taking notes about the movement of clouds or the behavior of winds. He had become obsessed with one of nature's most terrifying wonders, lightning. To most people, lightning was the wrath of God. To Franklin, it was the language of nature itself. He noticed how sparks jumped between charged metal objects and began to suspect that lightning was a form of electricity, the same mysterious energy he had seen in laboratory experiments with glass tubes and metal rods. This idea was revolutionary and dangerous. Electricity was still a mystery few understood. But Franklin, with his mix of daring and logic, was ready to test it in a way no one ever had. He began his experiments using Leyden jars, glass devices that could store electrical charge. He observed how small electric sparks behaved like tiny bolts of lightning, and how sharp metal points seemed to attract them. From this, he proposed something brilliant. If lightning and electricity are the same, then a metal rod could draw the lightning safely away, protecting buildings from destruction. It was a bold theory, and many laughed at it. But Franklin never cared for ridicule. His life had already taught him that truth doesn't bow to laughter. In 1752, under the heavy gray skies of summer, Franklin prepared the experiment that would make him immortal. It was a stormy day in June when he and his young son William Franklin carried a simple kite made of silk, strengthened by a wooden frame, into the field. Attached to it was a thin metal key and a length of twine, one of history's most famous contraptions. As thunder roared and the clouds darkened, Franklin let the kite rise higher and higher into the storm. The rain soaked him to the bone, but his eyes burned with purpose. He held the string by a silk ribbon to insulate himself, and then he waited. Moments later, the fibers of the twine began to stand up, trembling in the charged air. The key began to sparkle faintly. And then, in that electrifying instant, a small blue spark jumped from the key into Franklin's hand. It was not a myth anymore. Lightning was electricity. That spark, tiny yet mighty, changed the world. From that moment on, Benjamin Franklin wasn't just a man of ideas. He was the man who had touched the heavens. The experiment confirmed what no one had dared believe. He had proven that the terrifying bolts that once set forests ablaze could be understood, harnessed, and even controlled. And from that discovery came his most famous invention, the lightning rod. The lightning rod became a symbol of human reason triumphing over fear. Churches, homes, and ships began to install them, saving countless lives and buildings from fire. Franklin's genius had literally brought safety from the sky. But his curiosity didn't stop there. His studies of electricity led him to coin words we still use today: battery, conductor, charge, positive, and negative. He wasn't just experimenting. He was creating the language of modern science. Franklin became a global figure of intellect. Across Europe, scientists hailed him as a hero. The French Academy of Sciences honored him, and even in England, where colonial Americans were often dismissed, Franklin's name became synonymous with brilliance. Yet, through all the praise, he remained grounded. When asked about his discovery, Franklin didn't boast. He said simply, "I never knew a man who was good at making excuses who was good at anything else." His experiment was not just about electricity. It was about courage, the courage to question what everyone accepts, to challenge fear with reason, and to prove that no storm is too great for a determined mind. And soon, that same courage, the mind that dared to capture lightning, would be tested on a far greater battlefield: the fight for America's freedom. By the late 1760s, Benjamin Franklin was no longer just a printer, inventor, or philosopher. He had become the very embodiment of American intellect. His discoveries had made him a hero across Europe. His writings were quoted by scholars, and his name stood beside Newton and Voltaire. But back home, the air was changing. Across the Atlantic, Britain's grip on the colonies was tightening. Taxes, restrictions, and arrogance from London's Parliament were beginning to suffocate the growing spirit of freedom in America. Franklin, who had once served as a loyal British subject and even represented colonial interests in London, found himself standing at a crossroads between reason and rebellion. At first, he believed diplomacy could fix it. He spent nearly a decade in England, pleading for fairness, warning that the colonists were not enemies, but citizens demanding respect. Yet the British government, steeped in pride and blind to warning, refused to listen. They mocked his proposals and dismissed his warnings. The final straw came in 1774, when Franklin was publicly humiliated in front of the British Privy Council, ridiculed as a traitor simply for defending his people. He stood silent during the insults, his dignity unbroken, but inside him, something fierce ignited. That day, the loyal subject of the crown died, and the American patriot was born. When Franklin returned to Philadelphia in 1775, he stepped onto American soil with a heart ablaze. The first shots at Lexington and Concord had already been fired. The revolution had begun. And the man who once tamed lightning was now ready to tame empires. Franklin joined the Second Continental Congress, standing beside men like Washington, Jefferson, and Adams. His wisdom, calmness, and experience made him indispensable. When the Declaration of Independence was drafted, Franklin was one of its guiding minds. And when that sacred document was signed, he looked upon it and said his timeless words: "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." But the war was far from over. America needed something greater than courage. It needed allies, ships, money, and international recognition. And there was only one man capable of achieving that impossible task. In 1776, at the age of 70, Benjamin Franklin sailed through storm and uncertainty to the glittering courts of France. He arrived not as a rich nobleman, but as a humble philosopher, dressed simply in plain brown clothes and a fur cap, yet his presence in Paris created a sensation. The French adored him. He was celebrated not as a politician, but as a symbol of freedom, wisdom, and rebellion against tyranny. Portraits of Franklin were printed across Europe. Ladies wore medallions with his image, salons filled with talk of the Sage of America. He didn't need a crown. His mind was his crown, his simplicity his strength. Franklin worked tirelessly behind the scenes, charming ministers, convincing aristocrats, and slowly weaving the web of diplomacy that would change history. He used not force, but wit. He understood that winning a war was not only about soldiers, it was about belief. His greatest victory came in 1778, when after months of careful negotiation, France officially recognized the United States as an independent nation and agreed to an alliance against Britain. The French fleet, the weapons, the funds, all of it became the turning point that would eventually lead to American victory. Franklin, now nearing his 80s, continued to serve with a mind as sharp as ever. He mediated disputes, calmed tempers between rival American diplomats, and even charmed kings with his humor. When the war finally ended in 1783, it was Franklin who helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris, the agreement that officially ended the Revolutionary War and recognized the United States of America as free. As he signed that treaty, Franklin's eyes must have filled with quiet pride. He had come a long way, from a runaway printer's apprentice to the man who had stood before monarchs and reshaped the world's balance of power. Even in his final years in France, Franklin remained a legend. He refused luxury, continued writing essays on morality and progress, and once said, "Where liberty dwells, there is my country." When he finally returned to America in 1785, the people of Philadelphia welcomed him like a returning prophet. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and children ran alongside his carriage. He was old, frail, and weary, but his eyes still carried that same spark, the spark of the boy who once dreamed by candlelight. He had helped win a revolution not with swords, but with wisdom and words. He had done what few men ever could, united science, philosophy, and politics under the single banner of freedom. By the mid-1780s, Benjamin Franklin had become something almost mythical, the wise old man of a new world. His hair was white, his body frail, but his mind remained sharper than a blade. Decades of learning, invention, diplomacy, and sacrifice had forged him into a living embodiment of reason itself. He had returned home to a nation that owed him much, and still needed him. The Revolution was won, but America's peace was fragile. The young republic was struggling under weak leadership and divided states. The same courage that had won independence now threatened to dissolve into chaos. And once again, it was Franklin, old, calm, and brilliant, who was called upon to bring light where confusion reigned. In 1787, delegates from across the new nation gathered in Philadelphia to shape the future of the United States. The meeting that would become known as the Constitutional Convention. Among the younger men, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, sat 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, carried to the hall each day in a sedan chair because his legs could no longer bear him. Yet when he spoke, the hall fell silent. His voice, though soft, carried the authority of a lifetime of wisdom. He listened to the fiery debates about power, rights, and government. He saw pride clashing with fear, ambition with distrust. At times, the discussions grew so heated that the very idea of unity seemed to crumble. But Franklin's presence anchored them. He was the voice of moderation, always reminding them that they were not just writing laws, they were writing destiny. When tempers rose too high, Franklin would rise and say with a gentle smile, "The older I grow, the more I doubt my own judgment and pay more respect to the judgment of others." It was humility that silenced arrogance, wisdom that soothed division. During one tense session, when it seemed the delegates might abandon their work altogether, Franklin stood and gave one of the most moving speeches in American history. He urged the men to pray together, not as politicians, but as brothers seeking guidance. "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" His words brought tears to the eyes of hardened men. Slowly, compromise and cooperation returned. When the final draft of the U.S. Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787, Franklin looked upon the chair where George Washington sat and pointed to the carving of a rising sun on its back. He said softly, "I have often looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now, I know that it is a rising sun." It was a symbol not just of a document, but of hope, hope that the light of liberty would not fade. Franklin's signature on the Constitution carried more than ink. It carried the weight of 70 years of experience, the dreams of the Enlightenment, and the belief that reason and virtue must forever guide power. Even as his health declined, he continued to serve the public. He became the president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, making him one of the first American leaders to call for the end of human bondage. His last public act was a petition to Congress, urging the young nation to live up to its ideals of freedom for all. He had no army, no crown, no throne, yet his ideas had shaped the moral and intellectual foundations of the United States. Franklin often said, "A nation of well-informed men who have been taught to know and prize the rights which God has given them cannot be enslaved." He believed that the power of a country lay not in its gold or its guns, but in its wisdom, work, and virtue. As his life drew to a close, he looked back not with regret, but with wonder. From a runaway boy with a loaf of bread under his arm to a founding father whose mind touched every aspect of civilization, printing, science, diplomacy, politics, Benjamin Franklin had lived a life larger than history itself. He once wrote, with a smile of peace, "Would you live with ease, do what you ought, and not what you please?" And so he did. By 1790, the world around Benjamin Franklin had changed beyond recognition. The thunder of revolution had rolled across America, and even into Europe, where new voices now spoke of liberty, equality, and reason. He had lived to see ideas once whispered in secret rooms become the foundations of nations. Yet the old philosopher, now 84, felt the weight of time. His body, once filled with restless energy, was frail. His hands shook when he wrote, and his steps had grown slow. But his eyes, those keen, curious eyes, still glowed with the same spark that had guided him through lightning storms and political battles. He spent his final days in his modest Philadelphia home, surrounded by books, inventions, and letters from kings, scientists, and friends across the world. On his bedside table lay a worn Bible, beside it a draft of an essay on morality, and next to that, a letter from Thomas Jefferson. Even in his last days, Franklin kept writing, reading, thinking. He once said to a visitor, "When I am gone, do not bury me in sadness. Rejoice that I have lived." It was April 17th, 1790, when Benjamin Franklin finally closed his eyes. The city that had watched him arrive as a hungry runaway now mourned him as its greatest son. When word spread of his death, Philadelphia wept. Shops closed, bells tolled across the city, and thousands poured into the streets. Soldiers, politicians, apprentices, mothers, and children, they all came to say farewell to the man who had touched their lives in ways few could measure. More than 20,000 people joined his funeral procession, one of the largest America had ever seen. He was laid to rest beside his beloved wife Deborah, under a simple stone that read, "Benjamin and Deborah Franklin, 1790. No titles, no boast, just a name that had already become immortal." But his death was not an ending, it was a beginning. His ideas rippled far beyond the shores of America. In France, where he had once been adored as le philosophe américain, his death was mourned by the National Assembly with public prayers. Voltaire had called him the man who snatched lightning from the sky and the scepter from tyrants. And now, across Europe, thinkers saw him as proof that reason and courage could indeed change the course of humanity. Franklin's legacy was not just in what he built, but in how he thought. He had taught a generation that intelligence and virtue were the true engines of progress. He had shown that curiosity was not a sin, that laughter could coexist with wisdom, and that the power of an idea could outlast empires. His inventions, the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, the Franklin stove, became symbols of human ingenuity. His writings, like Poor Richard's Almanac, continued to teach thrift, patience, and common sense long after his death. And his political vision, a democracy founded on reason, liberty, and education, became the model for generations of nations to come. In the decades that followed, every great mind who sought progress found a part of Franklin within themselves. Thomas Jefferson called him the greatest man of our age. Abraham Lincoln later said that Franklin's moral clarity was a light that still guided the Republic. Even the great scientists of Europe, from Faraday to Maxwell, studied his experiments as the roots of modern physics. And in classrooms across the new America, children learned his name not as a statesman or inventor alone, but as a symbol of what one human being could become when knowledge and character walked hand in hand. Franklin's own words seemed to echo beyond his grave. If you would not be forgotten as soon as you are dead, either write things worth reading or do things worth writing. He had done both. Centuries later, his name still stands among those rare souls who changed the destiny of mankind, not through conquest or wealth, but through wisdom, wit, and unshakable faith in human potential. He was the son of a poor candlemaker who lit the world with his ideas. He was the runaway boy who became a founding father. He was Benjamin Franklin, the eternal flame of the Enlightenment, the philosopher of liberty, and one of the greatest minds to ever live. And as long as the light of knowledge burns in human hearts, his legacy will never fade.